There are certain experiences which are just soaked with wonder or possibility or mystery or holiness or magic. Certain days of play when you are a child that just flow together so that the entire afternoon just passes in one big whoop of joy. Or a quieter example, certain times when you are visiting with a friend and absolutely everything that can be said, can be shared between two people is found in 2 mugs of tea and a plate of cookies. All of that is there in the hum of an afternoon. Or sometimes, maybe, when you see further than you normally can. Phoebe talks about the experience of thinking about a friend or a colleague or a classmate who has not come to her mind in weeks or months or years. And then minutes later, hours later, that person will call or email or knock on the door. These are moments when something more than usual is apparent to us, when we see below the surface or maybe through the veil just a little bit, when we catch a glimpse of God. Back when I was in seminary, I read an article by the late theologian Sally McFaig, and in the article, McFaig used a turn of phrase that I hadn't heard before. The article actually wasn't about this turn of phrase, but sometimes you'll hear something and that will capture your imagination, and that's what happened. This turn of phrase just kind of reached up out of the book and grabbed a hold of me. And what McFaig said was that our ancestors lived in a sacramental universe. Our ancestors lived in a sacramental universe. And McFaig actually in the essay doesn't explain what she means by that term, and it didn't matter. I knew right away what she meant by that turn of phrase. That's the sort of experience I was talking about. In play, over tea, thinking of the friend and almost sort of calling them to call you. These are moments when we encounter outward and visible signs of an inward and spiritual state of grace, when we see God's fingerprints on the world. And McFaig, I think, argues that for our ancestors, it was easier to see the sacraments of everyday life, that our ancestors spotted them fairly readily and often and would say, of course, this is an indication of God being at work in the world. Of course, this thing that we've just encountered or just experienced is evidence of miracle. Today we hear the story of Jesus at a wedding. This is in the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, and this is traditionally the first miracle that Jesus performs. And this is a scene that is just soaked in sacrament, in outward and visible signs of grace. It is just soaked in metaphor and symbol. Let's see how many we can spot in actually a fairly short passage. So right off the bat, it is at a wedding. It's at this place of joining, right? So what is the language we often use about wedding? It's the joining of two flesh, much as in the incarnation, God is joined with humanity. The eternal Christ is joined with the temporal Jesus. So a very fitting place for Jesus to begin his adult ministry. This takes place 3 days after Jesus' baptism. How many things are contained in the number 3? There's an echo of the Trinity in this, and there is a foretaste. One of the weird things we do in the Christian tradition is we remember things that haven't happened yet. We remember the coming of Christ at the end of the days. And in this case, this wedding remembers the tomb. It's 3 days after Jesus' baptism, and now this miracle springs forth into the world, and at the end of Jesus' earthly life, he will spend 3 days in the tomb, and then this miracle will come forth. There's water How many things does water symbolize? This is this incredibly rich symbol that is found throughout Scripture. In the beginning, the Spirit moves over the water. When Israel is fleeing from Egypt, they pass through water that comes apart for them. Elijah and Elisha cross over water at the end of Elijah's life. Just 3 days ago, John has taken Jesus and turned the River Jordan into a baptismal font. We could keep on giving examples. Water is this thing we need to live. It is this thing that cleanses us. It's dangerous. We can drown in it. The water is held in 6 ritual jars. What does the number 6 mean? And this one, I'm not as confident about this one. 6 is twice 3. It's half the tribes of Israel. It's half the disciples. It is the number of active days of creation, isn't it? God creates the world over 6 days, and on that 6th and final day creates humanity and says humanity is very good. And then on that 7th day, God rests. What the water turns into is wine. So wine, which is this drink of festivity and celebration. I was reading a thing, I don't know if this is a tangent or not, but I'm just going to go for it, about drinking across history. And it argued that our ancestors, for millennia, human beings have drunk alcohol, but that for our ancestors, alcohol was almost exclusively consumed within community. It was almost exclusively consumed at a context like a wedding. It's a really modern idea to drink by yourself, and probably not actually a good one. So there is this celebratory consuming of alcohol, and this wine, which later on, at the institution of the Eucharist, Jesus is going to say, "This is my blood." These amazing and mysterious words. And there's abundance. There is, in a foretaste of so many of Jesus' miracles, I think of probably the one that is most famous, certainly the one the Gospels tell us most about, that we call the feeding of the 5,000. There's not enough. The party is ruined. And then Jesus shows up, and suddenly there's more than you could possibly want. There's this amazing reversal, and almost a comical reversal. Actually, maybe it's not even almost. Maybe it's like plain old comical. Listen to what the steward has to say. The servants bring out the wine, and the steward says, "This is the weirdest thing I've ever experienced, because everybody serves the good wine first and then saves the plonk for when the guests are hammered. But you've waited till everybody's hammered, and now you've brought out the good stuff. Now you've brought out the stuff that the sommelier would like. This is bizarre." There's probably even more symbols that we could find in this brief scene. It is rich, absolutely rich with symbol, absolutely rich with metaphor, absolutely rich with sacrament. Now, there are some terribly clever biblical scholars out there who are ready to argue. Well, they're not just ready to argue, they are arguing that the proliferation of symbol within this scene and of metaphor within this scene means that the authors and the people who told this story first intended for it to be taken strictly symbolically and strictly metaphorically, and that we err when we imagine that any of this might have actually happened. And I guess I understand that argument, and I've thought about it, and I think those scholars are spectacularly mistaken. Because I actually want to suggest that what we see in a scene like this, that is rich in symbol, rich in metaphor, rich in sacrament, is a story, is evidence that our ancestors lived in a sacramental universe. That this story assumes a world in which all the time you were encountering echoes of God, things that pointed you at God, and that when you encounter Jesus, the symbols are everywhere. When you're around Jesus, you can't walk 3 feet without tripping over God's foot, without tripping over the presence of God. So on Monday, I went to Willamette National Cemetery to inter Luann Deschenaux's ashes. Luann, who's a longtime member of the choir. And at the conclusion of the little ceremony, June, who is Luann's daughter, had arranged for there to be a dove release. And I'd never been to something where doves had been released previously, and if you had asked me in advance about a dove release, I would have said that's probably not for me. I probably would have said that sounds just a little hokey, possibly even a little maudlin in nature. And friends, I'm here to tell you, it was glorious. It was absolutely beautiful. Do we have a photo of this, Evelyn? I don't know if you can see that in the back there, but here they are. Here they are taking flight. The couple who arranged this, you can see Mike is one half of this couple. Jade is not in the photo. Arranged these baskets on the table and doves within, and had June and family come stand beside the baskets and say to Luann, "We love you, and farewell, and go on your journey, and we'll see you again." And then they opened the baskets, and out the doves flew. And it was extraordinary. It was a moment, like the baptism of Jesus when the dove descends, like the ascension when Jesus ascends. It was extraordinary. After the service, I talked to Jade and Mike, and it turns out this is what they do. They're folks who, that's their business, is releasing doves. I love learning about jobs like this. When I always loved that Mr. Rogers segment when he would go to different workplaces and talk to people who did different jobs. And when I was a child and people were asking, "What are you going to do when you grow up?" it did not occur to me to say I'm going to be in the dove release business. I didn't even think that was a job. So it was really wonderful to discover about this. And so we chatted, and I wanted to ask Jade a question that I actually was kind of worried about, which is, what happens to the doves? Because I thought, are we engaging here in ritualized animal cruelty? If these doves have been raised in captivity, are they going to fly out and go down to Providence Park and starve? Are they going to be eaten by cats? And I was, is this symbol actually less than awesome? I found it moving, but we're actually harming animals by doing it. And Jade said, the doves just are going to go home. We live over in Vancouver. We have 10 acres there. And because we're driving and the doves are flying, they're probably going to get there before we do. And she dug out this camera, it was a camera, I suppose, but it's actually a telephone. Tells you how incredibly dated my imagination is. Phones and cameras it's the same thing now. She dug out this phone and started showing me photos of is it a roost? I don't know. It's not a kennel. It's the place where the doves live. And there are these beautiful, Mike is a carpenter, these beautiful handcrafted nooks they can go into. There's a heater and an air conditioning unit. These doves live really well. Conveyor belt that brings them food, there's water, and there's this ragdoll cat that supervises the whole thing. This is dove heaven that these doves live in. And I realized as I was asking these questions and as I was getting curious about the dove release business, that this symbol was even richer than I had imagined. There was even a greater depth to it than I had imagined. There was the initial beauty of the doves being released and flying away, and it turned out that these doves were flying home to this amazing place. It's fantastic. I think it's C.S. Lewis who said that that we ought to study and pay attention to things that our ancestors have left for us, whether that's writing or music or dance or poetry or sculpture or paintings or still something else. And Lewis said that listening to our ancestors is important, not because they're any smarter than we are, but because they were unlikely to go wrong in the same direction as us. Our ancestors were less likely to make exactly the same mistakes that we make. We all make mistakes, but our ancestors probably made different mistakes than us. And I think something really important that our ancestors have to show us, whether it's in the Bible or elsewhere across human history, is this openness to a sacramental universe, this openness to the possibility that this is a world full of wonder and mystery, and that we find God's fingerprints throughout it. I respect and admire skepticism. I respect and admire the asking of questions. But I think a lot of what we call skepticism is actually reflexive hostility to ambiguity and paradox and uncertainty. So skepticism and wanting evidence for stuff is excellent in many, many contexts. That's what I want. When I'm in a plane, I would like that to be an evidence-based plane that we are flying on. I prefer it when my medical professionals rely on evidence for the choices that they're going to make in my healthcare. There's lots of examples. And there are limits to where evidence can take us. There are things that we must encounter on faith. And we know that when we go to a wedding. What is the evidence that the couple loves one another? You just know they do. Perhaps you've had the experience of trying to explain to someone why a joke is funny. It's hopeless. It's a completely hopeless experience. You can write this paradox and say, well, you expected the farmer to say this, but instead the farmer said this thing, and it's this completely anemic, pathetic experience. The joke's just funny, or it's not, as the case may be, but you get to decide that. That is up to you. There's so many other examples you can give. Is a piece of art beautiful? It just is or is not. And I think there's a humility in allowing for that, in allowing that there might be situations where we're invited to just be curious. And I think it's a real blind spot in the moment we live in, that a lot of what we call skepticism or intellectual rigor is actually just shouting down things that we find mysterious or that we find beyond our explanation. If we don't understand why someone has had a glimpse of the divine in, say, a near-death experience, to just make up an explanation and say, that's just what happens when a brain is in distress, when a brain is deprived of oxygen, even though there's no evidence for such a claim. This is not skepticism. This is just hostility to mystery. So I want to suggest this is something our ancestors have to teach us. And this is something this scene at Cana has to teach us, is this openness to wonder. When we're open to it, we may discover God in a moment of play as a child. We may discover the fingerprints of God in tea shared with a friend. We may find the fingerprints of God in thinking of a friend who has not come to our mind in a long time, just before they call up, or email, or knock on the door. We may find the fingerprints of God in doves flying back home. When we're open to wonder and possibility, when we're open to the whisper of God, we might just discover that sometimes water turns into wine.